colleague Sam will be speaking about how nitrogen management is not just a growing season issue. Presentation should only be about 30 minutes, and we'll have time for questions after. At the very end, I will share a QR code for any off-calf nitrogen management projects, which I feel quite a few of you will be here for to get that done before the deadline on December 15th. So with that, I will have Sam start us off.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, my name is Samantha Ilgulay. I am the Agricultural Climate Modelling Specialist for Ontario Soil and Crop. In this role, I work on a couple of different programs. I work on OFCAF, the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, but also Living Labs. And my main focus is to really complete research and also look into how different management practices can be used to support nitrogen management, sort of optimization and nutrient cycling year round. I'm also a recent PhD graduate from the University of Guelph, where I worked at the Elora Research Station, looking into non-growing season nitrogen movement and management in particular. So as we wrap up the 2025 sort of growing season and enter into the winter time, I was asked to present today's webinar and really bring nitrogen management back to the front of everyone's mind, remembering that it's not just an isolated growing season sort of thing we need to think about, but it is year round and it is long term. So yeah, realistically, I think we need to sort of non-growing season nitrogen management as a more sort of proactive approach to nitrogen management rather than a preventative one. I'm going to discuss that in sort of a couple of slides' time. But to kick off the conversation, I'm going to start with a general question, which is, well, why do we care about nitrogen? Why should I care so much? And I get asked this a lot. Normally it's from people who are sort of trying to find out why I spend so much of my time talking about soil. But it is a fundamental question that becomes more critical the more we hear about nitrogen being talked about outside of, productivity space and more in the news and in policy. And we can really look at it from sort of 2 points of view. And these are 2 points of view that often get talked about, but they often get talked about separately from one another. The first is this idea of productivity and profitability, and the second one is the environment. So if we talk about the first one, this productivity profitability idea, it really focuses on the fact that nitrogen is an essential nutrient for crops and for life in general. It is a core building block for essential molecules like chlorophyll, and simply without nitrogen, we can't grow our crops. So we want to add nitrogen to the soil in order to increase our crop yield. In doing so, we can increase the profitability of our farm. The flip side of that is when we add too much nitrogen and we lose it not to our crops, we're also directly losing money. So when we talk about this, we want to optimize nitrogen so that we can get the highest crop yield without risking our economic sort of element. And then the other side of things is the environment. So this links back to what I was talking about with nitrogen being lost. So when too much nitrogen is applied to a system and it's not used by our plants, it gets lost into the environment. This can be through sort of nitrate leaching or surface runoff. This sort of process leads to reduced water quality, either for our groundwater or our surface waters, as we increase the nutrient loading into those bodies. The other way that we can lose nitrogen to the environment is through greenhouse gas emissions, namely through the emission of nitrous oxide. So when nitrogen is sort of sitting at our soil surface, that's top 10 centimetres, and it's not being used by plants, and we've got a really wet environment, then we're going to get high emission rates, and those high emissions contribute to climate change. So what I find really interesting is that while we often talk about nitrogen from these two different perspectives independently, they really are intrinsically linked to one another. By optimizing your nitrogen rate, you can get the highest yield, you reduce your economic losses, and you also reduce your environmental losses. So it's sort of a win-win. So Another way we can sort of look at this and sort of understand how it all works together is by looking at the nitrogen cycle. So this is a sort of a very basic example of a cycle that I'm sure many of us have seen before. And it really just shows how nitrogen moves through an agricultural ecosystem. So for this cycle, we're looking at a cropping system. We've got corn growing, but really it is the same basic cycle for any food production system. Nitrogen enters into the soil through a number of different pathways. It can be biological fixation by legumes, it can be crop residue or manure decomposition, or it can be fertilizer application. Once in the soil, that nitrogen then becomes converted into a plant available form, ammonium or nitrate. A plant's then going to take it up. In this case, we have corn growing. And then when that corn is harvested, some of that nitrogen is going to get lost. And then when the crop sort of residue, corn stalks decompose, more nitrogen is going to get inputted into the soil. And the goal, or sort of in the ideal system, the supply of nitrogen to the soil is going to be exactly what the plant needs. So the plant takes up all available nitrogen and we sort of have a complete cycle. The issue is that this ideal system is really hard for us to sort of create because the rate and requirement of a plant for nitrogen is dependent on a lot of different factors. It's dependent on climate, water content, the availability of other nutrients. So more often than not, we end up applying more nitrogen than maybe is needed. And when that supply of nitrogen exceeds the crop demand, that is when we get nitrogen losses occurring. So the sort of annoying thing about nitrogen is that it doesn't like to sit still. So if you over apply nitrogen, even just a wee bit, it's not going to stay in the soil and sort of wait until a plant needs it. It's going to get used by soil microbes for energy. And that's what leads to our either downwards losses through leaching or our upwards losses through emissions. And that's, if it's a fertilizer, apply of nitrogen, then that's a direct economic concern because you're applying nitrogen for it to be directly lost, and it's those environmental consequences. So the thing I just wanted to highlight here really is that framing nitrogen optimization and nitrogen management is, its really goal is to ensure that the supply of nitrogen, both in rate and time, perfectly matches a plant's demand as much as possible, ensuring we get the highest yield and reduce those environmental concerns. So this sort of leads into the question, okay, so what can we do? How can we sort of create this ideal system? And it really does depend on how we are talking about it. So if we start in the growing season, just because this is a bit more familiar to people, we often talk about the growing season when it comes to nitrogen management. We're looking at a few different options. Common sort of recommendations that we've all heard before, I'm sure, include 4R strategies. This regards to how you are applying nitrogen, typically fertilizer. So you want to ensure you are applying the right rate, at the right time, in the right place, and the right source. We can also utilize other sort of practices like nitrification and urease inhibitors or slow release fertilizers. So all of these practices work to ensure that the sort of release of nitrogen into the soil matches plant demand. And in turn, they reduce our nitrogen losses, either nitrous oxide, N2O, or nitrate, 3-. But I sort of like to approach this as it's very important to utilize these practices, but it is in many ways a preventative measure. We are going to apply nitrogen in the growing season. We need to ensure we have sort of optimized crop productivity. And we're implementing these practices to prevent losses. Okay? When we take a step back from the growing season and look at nitrogen management from sort of the non-growing season or the annual point of view, we can start to switch how we approach nitrogen management from this preventative method to a more proactive strategy. So during the non-growing season, sometimes we get sort of not confused, but we have this sort of misidea that because it's cold and because there's a snowpack and because maybe the top few centimeters of your soil are frozen, we assume that nothing's happening under the ground, that everything's sort of just hibernating, taking its time, and that any nitrogen sitting there is going to stay there until the growing season. But this isn't really true. So the microbes that sort of control nitrogen cycling and control all our soil processes, they will stay active throughout the winter. And those nitrogen cycling processes will keep going. They become more prevalent when our soil begins to thaw and our snowpack melts away. So typically in the early spring, or if we sort of have a warm moment in the middle of winter, that's when we're more likely to see nitrogen losses, but they can occur really throughout the whole winter time. Unlike the growing season, we're often not directly applying nitrogen. We're not applying fertilizer in the middle of winter. So it can be, that's also an element why we don't necessarily think about non-growing season emissions. But by approaching the non-growing season with nitrogen management in mind, our goal is to ensure that we keep nitrogen in the soil, and all of that nitrogen that we keep in the soil now becomes available to our plant in the growing season. So that not only reduces our nitrogen losses during the whole year, but it also provides us an opportunity to reduce our fertilizer requirements in the growing season, reducing our economic input while still maintaining crop yields. Okay? And understanding these non-growing season processes and nitrogen losses and management is becoming increasingly important as our climate begins to change. So this diagram and this idea of how changing climate impacts nitrogen management is a bit of a hard one to get our head around. But if we think about our standard, or what we typically think of in the winter, in the non-growing season, we have really cold air temperatures and we have a pretty decent snowpack on our soil. And this snowpack, we typically would expect to stay there most of the year, or what we're used to is it staying there most of the year. And what that snowpack does is it insulates the soil. It almost acts as a blanket, and it means that our soil temperatures don't get that cold. Okay. Then so our soil sort of maintains nice and warm and it hangs out all winter. And then when our snowpack melts away in this early spring, then we will get one nitrogen loss event. Okay. And how big or small that event is going to be sort of dependent on what nitrogen management done throughout the non-growing season and whether nitrogen was applied in the late autumn. The issue is that as climate change does its thing and our average winter temperature does get warmer, we're getting lower and reduced snowpack depth. We're not only getting smaller snowpacks, but we're getting more inconsistent. So we'll get these patterns of it'll be really cold with a decent snowpack for like a week or two, sort of like we have this week, at least in Guelph. And then the weather will warm up and all that snow will melt away. And then maybe after another week, it will get cold again and it will snow again and the snow will hang out for 2 weeks and then it will get warm and then it will get cold. And that fluctuating pattern creates more opportunities for the soil to freeze and then thaw and then freeze and then thaw. Okay? So it essentially removes that insulation effect. So now what we're getting is we're getting more frequent and more severe nitrogen loss events occurring throughout the non-growing season. Okay, so not only are we getting sort of nitrogen losses as a bad thing, but they're becoming more frequent. And as it becomes more frequent, it becomes a more critical source. And I like to think of it for every sort of molecule of nitrogen that is lost during the non-growing season, that's essentially one more molecule of nitrogen that you have to add to the soil in the growing season. So now it becomes sort of this economic balance where, oh, my fertilizer requirement is increasing because I'm losing my nitrogen more rapidly. Another thing about sort of these warmer winters and climate change is, as well as increasing nitrogen losses during the non-growing season, they're also having an effect in the growing season. So when we have those warmer winters and we have those inconsistent snowpacks and more drastic freezing and thawing, there are long-term changes in our soil conditions that occur. So then as we enter into sort of the early spring and the early growing season, we'll have colder soils, we'll have either drier or wetter soils, sort of depending on where you are. And all of those factors are going to impact your crop growth. So now we're having sort of our crop is uptaking less nitrogen. So if you don't alter your fertilizer applications, we're seeing more nitrogen losses occurring not only in the non-growing season, but also in the growing season. Okay. And this graph here sort of shows a bit of that data. So these graphs look at the average nitrous oxide sort of surface flux, or the loss of nitrogen from the soil surface per day for 3 growing seasons. So in 2021, corn was planted. In 2022, we had soybeans. And in 2023, we had winter wheat, followed by a 4-species cover crop. And we looked at 2 different soils. So we looked at a silt loam and a sandy loam. And what the graph shows is the grey line is what I've called non-warmed, but it's essentially the soils were exposed to just standard air temperatures and snowpack conditions. So nothing was altered. They were just left out there to do their thing during the winter. And then the black line is a warm treatment. So these soils, they were exposed to those increased winter temperatures, lower snowpack depth, more fluctuations were occurring. And then we looked at, well, how did that difference in non-growing season sort of weather conditions impact these nitrogen losses in the growing season? And what we saw is that we saw a 33% increase in nitrogen losses from the warmed soils. Okay? And I've sort of put these sort of green circles here just to draw our eyes to specific events. So in 2021, both soils identified what I've called sort of peak loss events. So we had these really increase in nitrous oxide emissions. And in 2023, the loam soil also experienced that. And what's really important to note that each of these loss events occurred directly after fertilizer was applied. So what we're seeing is that winter warming and these increasing winter temperatures with climate change are increasing our nitrogen losses following fertilizer. So you're adding fertilizer, but now more of it is not even going to the plant. It's just being lost into the environment. Okay? So all of this sort of sets the scene for nitrogen management in the non-growing season. We've discussed the economic and environmental benefits, this idea of, well, why do we care about nitrogen and why is nitrogen management so important to us? The goal is really to optimize nitrogen supply to mitigate economic and environmental concerns, understanding that intrinsic link between the two. We then talked about specifically, well, what is non-growing season versus growing season nitrogen losses and nitrogen management, understanding that in the growing season, we're actively applying nitrogen and trying to prevent losses. Well, in the non-growing season, we can manage our soils, manage our nitrogen to be more proactive to ensure that more nitrogen is in our soil for our next growing season. Yeah. And then lastly, understanding that as our climate changes, we need to focus on these non-growing seasons and this annual point of view of nitrogen management a bit more. It's becoming more important as our nitrogen losses are drastically increasing. So then this leads into the fundamental question of, well, what can I do about it? What does non-growing season nitrogen management really look like? And the truth is, it looks very similar to growing season nitrogen management. You're just changing your sort of lens on how you're looking at it. So, firstly, key one that we can do is overwinter cover crops. Cover cropping, especially in the winter, has been shown to be one of the most successful ways to reduce nitrogen losses, particularly nitrate leaching. So if you have more well-drained or sandy soils, overwinter cover crops can be really successful to reduce our losses and keep that nitrogen in the soil, essentially, in the plants. There's a few things we sort of can keep in mind and can sort of focus on when it comes to implementing overwinter cover crops as a practice. But it's really important not to get bogged down in the details or overwhelmed by how many options there are available to us. A lot of people will talk about their 10 species cover crop mix or their 15, or whether you should use legumes or not, how deep should the roots be, etc. And for somebody just starting out, it can be really confusing, and sort of the easiest thing to do can just be not do anything. But the truth is that as long as you have, even if it's just one crop, as long as it's well established and it's there over the winter, you're doing great. You're doing something, and that's better than nothing. So the goal is really just simply to avoid having a bare soil. You really want to always have active roots growing in our soil post-harvest. okay? Because that's going to just simply reduce how much nitrogen is being lost by absorbing it. Looking a bit more at the details, there are a couple of different options. So commonly people will sort of cover crop after harvest. You harvest your cash crop, wait, come in with a cover crop. That's going to leave a short period of bare soil between your cover crop being harvested, so your cash crop being harvested and your cover crop being sort of established. But as long as you have that establishment by the winter and by the early spring, then you'll see the benefits of that cover crop. Recent work has also been done regarding the role drone seeded cover cropping should have. So this allows us to seed the cover crop into a standing cash crop, meaning that by the time we harvest that cash crop, the cover crop is already established to some extent. And some work is being done within this practice in OCA's Living Labs project. So you can sort of make the best decision for you which one to go with. It's fairly up to you. As long as you have that soil covered and those active roots present, you'll be sweet. Another thing to look at is species, what type of cover crop. There's a few different ways, so you can go legume or non-legume. A legume cover crop is really beneficial because it can act as a natural supply of nitrogen into your soil and therefore reduce your need for sort of synthetic applications in the growing season. The issue here is that legumes also have a really high nitrogen content in their plant material. So if you are going to terminate that cash crop and let it decompose back into your soil, that's going to act as a really high nitrogen load. So you're going to want to make sure that you maybe reduce or alter your other forms of nitrogen that are entering into the system so you don't overwhelm the system. This is where it could be recommended that if you're going to use a legume cover crop, you ensure that you either sort of have a non-legume growing at the same time, or you ensure that when that legume is that crop residue is decomposing, you have a cash crop or a non-legume cover crop there to sort of soak up that nitrogen that's supplied. If you have a really well-drained soil, such as a more sandy base, then ensuring that you have a deep rooting cover crop is going to be sort of recommended or important to you, because in those sort of well-drained systems, we suffer more nitrogen leaching, so more of our nitrogen goes down the profile, and those really deep roots just allow the plants to access more of it and reduce it going all the way into it. So these could be radish, lucerne, are sort of widely common ones that are used. And then lastly, there's how can we manage cover crops? So are you going to let your residue decompose once it's terminated? Are you going to graze the cover crop? If you're sort of doing either of those things, you want to be aware of how much sort of organic matter and nitrogen those practices are going to add into the soil and just sort of counteract your fertilizer applications to sort of represent that. And then there is the last question that gets brought up a lot regarding cover crops is, well, do I need a fertilizer? So if you are utilising a cover crop, sort of maybe like winter wheat, where an additional fertilizer application is commonly applied, either in sort of with planting or in the early spring, then you just want to sort of be aware and ensure that you're following sort of our fertilizer application best management practices when you are applying it. But as I said at the start, fundamentally, you can get bogged down in all the details and sort of get overwhelmed. But as long as you are doing what works for your system and you are getting an established cover crop, then it doesn't really matter exactly what type or how many. Okay, just have that soil covered. And then as I mentioned there, we sort of briefly touched on those nitrogen application principles, and that's really our next sort of key management practice that we're going to do. So whether you're applying nitrogen in the form of fertilizer, manure, or another organic amendment, and whether that application is occurring in the fall or the spring, you want to ensure that you're following the best management practices to ensure that the supply of nitrogen is most meeting the plant demand, both in rate and time. So our most common sort of best management practice when it comes to nitrogen application is our 4 R's. So that's right time, right place, right rate, and right source. So when we're talking about right time, it's all about avoiding those high nutrient loss periods So these commonly are really wet conditions following intense rainfall or snow melt in the early spring. So we just want to make sure that we don't have excess nitrogen at those times. We don't want to apply nitrogen right before heavy rainfall, just because more of it is going to be lost into the system. We also want to match our plant demand. So we want to avoid applying nitrogen at times where there isn't a demand for a bioplant. So you don't really want to apply nitrogen onto a fallow soil, whether that's a manure application or an other organic amendment. You also don't want to avoid applying nitrogen when the soil temperatures are really cold or, like I said, really wet, just because you're going to have reduced plant sort of growth on its own. So avoiding that late autumn, early winter period as much as possible is really recommended. Right place, this really focuses on, we want to ensure that the plant has access to the nutrients and is able to take up those nutrients before they are lost to other pathways. So applying our nutrients below the soil surface and as close to the root zone as possible is going to be the best bet. If you're applying manure or an organic amendment, sort of ensuring that it's mixed in as much as possible is going to be key. The more sort of nutrients that we have just sitting at the soil surface, the more likely they are to get lost by surface runoff and erosion or through those greenhouse gas emissions. Right rate, that really looks at considering all of the other sources of nitrogen, particularly that you have in your system, and really assessing whether or not you have an opportunity to change or alter your nitrogen loading rate regarding fertilizer. So if you have a cover crop over the winter and let it terminate and decompose, or if you apply manure to your system, all of those supply a source of nitrogen. So therefore you might need to, or might want to just alter your loads a bit more. We also want to account for field variability. So acknowledging that there's a lot of differences in a simple field, let alone a whole farm. So topography differences, if you have a slight high area in your field, that's going to have a lower nutrient availability than the low part. So therefore, maybe your low area needs slightly less nutrients applied than your high. So just accounting for that variability, if possible, variable fertilizer rates. All of that is just going to ensure that you're only applying what the plant needs, getting the max productivity you can, and reducing those losses. And then lastly, right source. Ensure that you're applying all the essential nutrients, so not only nitrogen, but potassium, phosphorus, all of those, because they're all essential to plant growth. So we've discussed sort of the two main ones, overwinter cover crops, avoiding that fallow non-growing season, and then really optimizing our nitrogen application to match plant demand. And the last point is to really understand our soil conditions and where we can do work to improve them. And the soil condition we mainly are talking about is soil structure. And that's the stability of our aggregates and how sort of continuous our macro and micro pore network is in the soil. So good soil structure is going to be really stable aggregates with a good solid pore network, allowing for water and air to move through our soil nicely. Meanwhile, poor soil structure is going to have really unstable aggregates. They're going to be really prone to erosion, compaction issues, which can lead to waterlogging, poor drainage, or very rapid drainage. And the reason that we sort of want soil structure to be good and solid is because it directly impacts how water moves through the soil, and in turn how fast and what type of nitrogen losses we're going to encounter. So in a case of rapid drainage, we're going to get really fast water movement down through the profile, and that rapid water movement is going to push nitrogen out past the root zone, past where the plants can access it, and leach it into the groundwater. On the other hand, poor drainage, so compaction, is going to lead to really high nitrogen emissions, so that nitrous oxide. Because we're going to have really waterlogged conditions, plant uptake of nitrogen is going to decrease, and more of that nitrogen is going to come off the soil surface. So this really frames why soil structure is so important and how it impacts nitrogen management. The next question is, well, what can we do about it? The first step is to understand, well, what is your soil structure? And understand that soil structure is different to soil type. So soil type, referencing sand, silt, clay particles, they can either be good or bad in terms of soil structure. So you can have a sandy soil with a good soil structure, and you can have a silt loam with a bad soil structure. Okay. The way we can test soil structure is if you sort of take a good aggregate, a good clump of soil, and break it apart with your hands. If you can visually sort of see aggregates there in a nice pore network, that's a great sign. The other way I like to test soil structure is sort of take a shovel, collect some soil, tap it on the ground. If the aggregates stay together as you're sort of tapping it and applying that force, then that indicates you have a good soil structure. If your soil begins to sort of rapidly break apart into small and fine particles, then it indicates maybe it's not as good as it could be. But the great news is that we can always work to improve and maintain soil structure. The way we can do that is really by ensuring that we have a high organic matter content, and this is going to be really important going into the winter. So as you leave your growing season and enter into the non-growing season, you really want to optimize your organic matter content. So having those crop residues decompose, maybe incorporating manure, all of those are going to add organic matter in. And organic matter really, it works as like a glue or a sponge. So it allows soil particles to clump together and form those aggregates. It also soaks up water and it really traps nutrients. So if you have a lot of nitrogen in your soil sort of post-harvest and entering into the non-growing season, organic matter will work to trap it. It will stay there over the winter. And then as you have your subsequent growing season come in and plants start needing that nitrogen, it slowly becomes available through mineralization. And then the other factor that we can sort of look at when assessing how can we improve our soil structure is tillage. Namely, you want to be using sort of no-till or reduced till systems. Tillage works to essentially break up those aggregates, and if we do it too much, we really lead to poor soil structure. So utilizing those no-till, reduced till practices as much as possible really works to maintain the organic matter content, maintain stable aggregates, and support really good water movement and reduce nitrogen losses in our system. So overall, like I said before, all of these sort of points are things that we would have heard about and likely have talked about in the context of growing seasons. But it's just really important to understand that they do have a really critical role when it comes to our non-growing season. And as we leave our growing season in the late autumn, early winter, and begin to enter into our sort of cold period, we want to make sure we're doing as much as possible to support keeping nitrogen in the soil, reducing nitrogen losses, and in turn supporting our next growing season as much as possible. So keeping those soils covered with active roots growing, applying nitrogen only following sort of best management practices, and maintaining a really stable soil structure are going to be key. So this really comes to the end of today's presentation and my quick recap. Really, I just want to bring highlight of sort of what we're focused on, understanding that when it comes to the non-growing season and nitrogen management, we're really being proactive. Our goal is to reduce nitrogen losses, therefore reducing both the economic and environmental consequences of them while supporting optimum plant growth in our next growing season. As sort of climate change happens and does its thing, we have warmer winter temperatures, we have less snowpack, and in turn we're getting more nitrogen losses annually, so both in the non-growing season and the growing season. So this focus on proactive nitrogen management annually and long term is going to be really important, and we really want to keep it in our minds. And the key ways we can do that, very similar to the growing season, keeping our soils covered, applying nitrogen only as needed to meet plant demand, and really maintaining our soil structure and our soil health practices as much as possible. So that really comes to the end of